Well, hi folks, and welcome to the 19th video in my Getting Started series for the game B-17 Flying Fortress The Mighty Eighth. Now in this video we're going to be going through Fighter School number 4, which is going to cover the US AAF fighter, the P-51 Mustang. Now I'm not going to go into all of the details I've done in prior fighter schools because there's so much overlap amongst them. So what I would suggest is if I haven't answered anything in this video, that you go back and watch some of my prior fighter school videos first. Anyway, in the meantime, we'll kick off with the overview. Now, considered by many to be the best fighter of the war, the Mustang began life with an Allison engine as an underpowered, low-altitude attack aircraft. But when it had the excellent Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine installed, it was transformed into a superb high-altitude escort fighter. And with a pair of drop tanks, the Mustang could escort from England to anywhere in Germany. Now in fact, the P-51D that we are flying around here in the game, and that's what's modelled within the B-17 game, actually was fitted with 5 fuel tanks. There was a central fuselage tank, which was introduced with the D model. There are 2 wing tanks, and also the 2 underwing external drop tanks. Now, the fuselage tank had a capacity of about 85 US gallons, the wing tanks had 92 US gallons each, and the drop tanks had 75 US gallons each. And that gave the P-51D model a total fuel capacity of around 419 US gallons, hence its enormous range and effectiveness as an escort fighter. Now, as I say, it entered service in, I think, around mid-1944 as an escort fighter for the B-17s, for the US 8th Air Force. And it was very successful in that role. Now, the P-51D was, I believe, the most produced version of the P-51. And this particular P-51D that is used as an escort fighter in the game is equipped with 6 wing-mounted .5 caliber Browning machine guns, and I'll just let those rip right now. So I'll just get a frontal view. You can see all the shell casings firing behind, and let's have a look at the frontal view so we can see those tracer shells. Okay folks, so let's move on to the P-51D cockpit tour, and so we're going to head on over to Duxford Air Base, so I'll see you in a moment. So welcome to Duxford Air Base. Now Duxford Air Base is located about 9 miles south of Cambridge in Cambridgeshire. Now from April 1943 it was home to the US AAF's 78th Fighter Group. Now they were originally equipped with P-47s, but around December 1944, they were converted to P-51 Mustangs. Now, what's famous about Duxford Air Base, apart from its usage during the war, and it was used during the war earlier by the RAF and also by other US AAF fighter groups, the famous thing about it now is currently home to the Imperial War Museum, which is really cool. So here's the beautiful P-51D that we're going to explore today. But before we dive into the cockpit, I just want to point out a couple of features. The first is that the P-51D is equipped with a 4-bladed propeller, and that's the same as the P-47 Thunderbolt. Now what's interesting is that we compare that to the 2 German fighters that we've looked at so far, the Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. They were both equipped with 3-bladed propellers. Now, I'm not an air sim buff, I don't understand airplanes. I'm not going to get into a discussion around the choice between 2 or 3 or 4 bladed propellers. It's just an interesting observation I thought I'd point out to you guys. If you have got any interesting comments or discussion about the reasoning behind that, I'd love to know it. So yeah, let's have a chat about that in the comments section below. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier that there are 2 drop tanks. Now, the interesting thing about the P-51D is that the drop tanks, well, the fact is that there are drop tanks. There are 2 drop tanks, whereas all of the planes that we've looked at so far have only ever had a single drop tank mounted underneath the main fuselage, whereas the P-51D has 2 drop tanks, one mounted under each of the wings. So that's an interesting difference there. And I guess that was because that allowed them to carry a greater fuel load in those drop tanks than might have been permissible with a fuselage mounted drop tank. Don't forget, in the overview I did mention all the different fuel tanks that are available on the P-51D, and including the external drop tanks, there are 5 fuel tanks on this plane with a total of 419 US gallons. So that gave the P-51D its enormous range and its ability to basically roam almost anywhere over Germany. I think that's about it. So that's really all I wanted to point out on the outside. So let's dive into the cockpit and we'll go through the cockpit tour right now. So we'll just press F1 to pop inside. So welcome to the P-51D cockpit. Now, as usual for the cockpit tour, I'm going to start off at the top of the cockpit above the instrument dash, and as such we'll begin by discussing the gun sight. Now, in my prior fighter school videos, I've skipped over any details of how to operate the gun sights due to a lack of information available to me at that time. As such, I couldn't provide any real guidance on how you should use and adjust the gun sights other than to just leave the settings at their defaults. Fortunately though, this has now changed for the gun sights used in the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. But before we get into the details, let's just do a recap of the German gun sight we've seen so far, because that is relevant. Now, if you remember, the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 are both fitted in this game with the same Revi reflector gun sight. Now, this is a fixed gun sight in that the target cross is stationary at the center of the reflective display. This means that when firing at a moving target, you need to place your crosshairs ahead of the target to a sufficient degree that the target and bullets collide. And this technique is known as leading the target or deflection shooting. And there's plenty of information available on the internet about this, so I will not be covering that here. But judging how much to lead a target requires a lot of knowledge, practice and skill, and was and is a shortcoming of many inexperienced pilots, including me. Now, to simplify the process of deflection shooting for pilots and to generally increase their accuracy, the Americans developed a range of computing gun sights. Now, these gun sights automatically calculated the lead needed ahead of the target and moved the crosshairs accordingly. Although instead of crosshairs, they simply placed a dot in the center where the crosshairs would cross. Now, most P-51D models were equipped with what was known as the K-14 computing gun sight, as seen here. Now, the K-14 though did not appear in significant numbers in P-47s until around the middle of 1944. However, in this game, all P-47s as well as all of the P-51s are equipped with the same K-14 gun sight. In terms of operation, the first step is to set the wingspan of your target by adjusting the sight span dial, and this is graduated in feet. In this game, you'll only be targeting enemy fighters as opposed to bombers and ground targets, which greatly simplifies things. Now, the wingspan of the Messerschmitt 109 is around 32 feet, the Focke-Wulf 190 is around 34 feet, while the rocket-powered Messerschmitt 262 is around 41 feet. Now, I found an interesting wartime guide on using the K-14, and this advises the reader that if their aircraft identification is feeble, their word, not mine, that they should set this dial as follows: 25 feet for a single engine plane, 60 feet for a twin engine plane, and 110 feet for a 4-engine plane. However, in this game, although we know that we're only tackling single engine fighters, we know that their minimum wingspan of the fighters we'll be engaging is 32 feet, so certainly don't set your dial below that. By default, as you can see, the game sets this dial to 30 feet, so it's probably worthwhile increasing this to say 33 feet so that it more closely matches that of the 109 and the 190. If you were to encounter any 262s, then I would suggest that at that time you increase this setting to around 41 feet. The other adjustment dial on the K-14 is what the game refers to as the gun sight convergence dial. Now, in reality, this was actually referred to as the range dial. In practice though, this dial was actually adjusted by twisting the grip on the throttle. Now this is not possible in this game, and as such the only way to adjust this dial is to left click on the dial to increase the setting and to right click on the dial to reduce the setting. The dial is marked with the range in hundreds of feet. So with the default setting of 9, this corresponds to 900 feet, which is 300 yards, which also corresponds to the default gun convergence setting in the game options. Therefore, unless you change the gun convergence setting in the game options to something other than 300 yards, leaving the gun sight convergence dial at its default of 9 makes sense. Obviously, if you do change the gun convergence in the game options, then make sure you adjust the gun convergence dial accordingly. The sight span dial setting and the gun convergence dial settings are both used by the K-14 gun sight to compute the lead required for your target. The gun sight also takes as input the aircraft's rate of turn and rate of climb or descent. As you can see, in level flight the gun sight stays centered as no lead is required. To target an enemy with a wingspan as set and a range of 900 feet or 300 yards, you simply wait until the target's wingspan fills an imaginary circle formed by the ring of dots that surround the central dot. When it does, this indicates that the range to the enemy is the same as the gun convergence setting of 900 feet or 300 yards. The time to fire though is when the center dot is on the target, and the K-14 guide recommends firing for a minimum of 2 seconds. Now if the aircraft is turning or climbing or descending, the center and surrounding dots move away from the center of the reflective glass by an amount that corresponds to the lead calculated by the gun sight. Again, all the pilot needs to do is to ensure that the target's wings fill the width of the outer imaginary circle, place the center dot over the target and fire for a minimum of 2 seconds. Although, as I've certainly found, this is much easier said than done. My belief is that the game's designers intended for the player to leave the gun convergence dial at a fixed setting such that it corresponds to the gun convergence set in the game options. After all, they did change the name of the dial from range dial to gun convergence dial. However, according to the K-14 guide, this was not how the K-14 was recommended to be operated. In practice, when pilots were engaging an enemy, they would twist the grip on the throttle to adjust the circle of dots to surround the wingtips of the target. Although in this game, dynamically adjusting the gun convergence dial with the mouse while chasing and targeting an enemy with a keyboard or joystick is, in my view, just too difficult to be able to do effectively. Having said that, I am a little confused. For your guns to be most effective, it is best to hit an enemy when they are at or near the convergence range of your guns. At that point, the rounds of ammunition from all of the guns will be hopefully striking your enemy as they converge at that point. If pilots in reality use the throttle grip to dynamically change the gun sight range dial setting when in combat, and therefore fired at targets before or beyond their fixed gun convergence, was this not a much less effective method than trying to target them when they reached your gun convergence setting distance? If anyone can shed some light on this, please let me know in the comments section. Now before we leave the gun sight, I just wanted to show you some of the examples of right and wrong targeting provided in the K-14 guide, because there's some excellent examples in there. So first of all, we have a correct targeting example with the wingspan filling the imaginary outer circle with the center dot on the target. The next correct example again meets the necessary criteria, but this time the target's profile is different. And the final correct example shows that on broadside attacks, the circle should be a trifle larger than the length of the fuselage, as the wingspan is greater than the length. Now, the first incorrect example shows the wingspan being correct, but the center dot is not on the target. Remember, there is no need to lead with a K-14 gun sight. It leads for you. The second incorrect example shows a circle being too large, which makes the range and lead angle wrong. You will miss an example despite the fact that the center dot is on the target. And in the third incorrect example, it states that the circle doesn't correspond to the target's wingspan. However, no matter how long I look at this example, it still looks correct to me. So if someone can actually tell me why that example is deemed to be incorrect, I'd love to know. One final note on this gun sight is that it was possible for pilots to change the mode of operation to a fixed gun sight mode, like the German Revi gun sight. I believe this mode would primarily, though, have been used for attacking ground targets. Regardless, the option to switch between computing and fixed gun sight modes is not available in this game. The K-14 gun sight in this game is locked in computing mode. So anyway, without further ado, let's now move on and we shall move down to the instrument dash panel and we'll go through the instrumentation and controls. Okay, so let's move on to the rest of the cockpit tour now. So first of all, I'm actually just going to press M to go into manual mode, and then I'm going to hold down Control and tap P, which will then allow me to use the hat switch on my joystick to free look around the cockpit. And if you want to know how to look through all the different cockpit views and the different methodologies that you can use, the different controls you can use to look around the cockpit, then please check out my first fighter school video because I go through all of those controls in that video. Anyway, so with the P-51 here, I'm going to go through the same procedure I've done in prior fighter schools. I'm going to go along each row of instruments from left to right until we get to the bottom. And then I'm going to cover the central panel at the bottom of the P-51 cockpit. I'm going to move on to the left-hand side of the cockpit after that, and then finally the right-hand side of the cockpit. So first of all, we'll start in the top left corner here, and we'll start off with the compass. Now, what we see here is actually a slightly different compass to that used in the P-47. In fact, it's quite different from that used in the P-47. And it is actually a remote indicator compass. Now, this replaces the conventional magnetic compass of previous aircraft. And the remote compass is actually installed in the left wing. And it electrically transmits its readings to this indicator on the instrument panel. Now, the advantage of this type of compass was that it didn't float around and fluctuate then when the aircraft was maneuvered, which was always the advantage that the directional gyro had over the conventional magnetic compass. Now, I have finally discovered the purpose of the adjustable parallel arrows in the compass display. Woohoo! Remember, these can be adjusted by left or right clicking on the compass adjustment knob, and I'll just show you that right now. So left clicking moves it clockwise and right clicking moves it anti-clockwise. Now the purpose of these arrows is actually to set a desired heading, and we'll just move it around to say the current indication there. So let's say that was your desired heading. So what it now provides is a quick visual indication so that you can verify if you're on course or not. So you didn't really need to pay attention to what the needle was pointing to, just all you had to really do was pay attention and make sure that it was between those two parallel arrows that you had previously set up as being your desired course. So that's fantastic. So I finally solved that mystery for myself, and I hope that helped you guys out as well. Okay, so moving then on over to the right hand side, we've got the manifold pressure gauge. And this effectively shows the power output from the engine and is adjusted by means of the throttle. Now, the units of this gauge are inches of mercury, and the gauge is ranged from 10 to 75 inches of mercury. Now, the green range indicates the normal operating range, which is, in this instance, 26 to 36 inches of mercury. And the red line indicates full military power of 61 inches of mercury. Now, bear in mind that when you are running with war emergency power, which you activate by pressing the K key on the keyboard, then this increases the manifold pressure all the way up to 67 inches of mercury. But you always got to bear in mind that in reality, war emergency power was always supposed to be a temporary short-term boost of power. So we'll move on down to the next row now, and we have the airspeed indicator. And this displays the current indicated airspeed, and it's ranged from 50 to 700 miles per hour on this gauge. Now there is a red line, it's a little bit hard to see, And that red line is actually at 505 miles per hour. And that indicates the maximum permissible speed when you are at an altitude of 5,000 feet or less. So pretty low altitude. Now, an important consideration for pilots to remember was that the maximum permissible indicated airspeed reduces as altitude increases. However, as engine management and associated damage is not modeled in this game for fighters, you, as the player, you do not need to worry about that speed limitation at all. Now, moving on over, we have the directional gyro. Now, the directional gyro is used to supplement the magnetic compass, basically as a backup. Now, this indicator is non-magnetic and as such is not subject to the same failure mechanisms that a magnetic compass may be. So the chances of both the magnetic compass and directional gyro failing during a mission are extremely small. Now, the directional gyro is also provided with an adjustment knob, although in this game there is little if any need to do that. It's adjusted by either left or right clicking on the knob, and I'll just show you that right now. So left clicking moves it in one direction, right clicking moves it in another, and it actually moves very fast, so it's very difficult to do fine adjustments on this. In reality, the knob could also be pushed in to cage the gyro should it be necessary to prevent damage to the gyro caused, for example, by flying at unusual attitudes during combat. But again, that's something you really don't need to worry about in this game. Moving on over, we have the gyro horizon. Now, the gyro horizon indicator indicates the longitudinal and lateral attitude of your plane relative to an artificial horizon. And the artificial horizon is the thick white line here, and the thin white line is essentially a representation of, I guess, the wings of your aircraft. Now, the scale around the outside indicates the bank of your aircraft up to 90 degrees. So this little white mark here actually moves either clockwise or anti-clockwise as you essentially turn or bank your plane. And so that where that white indicator lines up will tell you the angle that you are currently banking at, up to the 90-degree point anyway. And similarly to the P-47 in this game, the gyro horizon occasionally stops working and just shows a blank display. And again, I have not managed to determine what causes this to happen. Next over, we have the coolant temperature. And the coolant temperature gauge obviously indicates the temperature of the engine coolant, and it's graduated from -50 all the way up to 150 degrees C. Now, this gauge can be safely ignored, seeing as engine management for fighters is not modeled in the game. Now, when the engine is started, this gauge shows a fixed reading of around 100 degrees C, and it never moves away from that. So we'll now move on down, we'll actually go down, I think, to the carburetor air temperature next. Now, the carburetor air temperature gauge shows the temperature of the air running through the carburetor air scoop. And again, it's graduated from -50 all the way up to 150 degrees C. Again, this gauge can be safely ignored, seeing as engine management for the fighters is not modeled. Now, when the engine is started, like the coolant temperature gauge, this gauge just moves on up to its normal reading, which is somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees C, and it just stays at that. Now, moving on over to the right, we have the tachometer. Now, the tachometer gauge shows the current engine speed in revolutions per minute. Again, there's a green range, and this green range indicates normal operation all the way through from 1600 to 2700 RPM. Now, note that 2400 RPM is the cruise maximum, while 2700 RPM is for maximum continuous use. There's also a red line on here, and the red line indicates the short-term maximum RPM of 3000, which is applicable when taking off or operating under military maximum power, which has a 15-minute limit normally, or war emergency power, which has a 5-minute limit to prevent damage to the engine. However, again, these limits can be safely ignored in this game, seeing as engine management for fighters is not modeled. So next of all, we'll go back over to the next row. So we'll move on over to the left and move down, and we'll go over to the suction gauge. Now, the suction gauge indicates if the vacuum pump is providing proper vacuum for the system. Now, this is graduated from 0 to 10 inches of mercury. And when the engine starts, the normal reading is just over 4. And similarly to those other gauges, this gauge can be safely ignored, as I'm pretty confident that damage to the vacuum system is not modelled in the game. And just for your interest, there are 3 instrument gauges that rely on the vacuum system to operate correctly, and these are the gyro horizon, the bank and turn indicator, which we'll come on to shortly, and the directional gyro. So next up, we'll go down to the clock, and as you'd expect, the clock simply indicates the current time of day in the game. Then we'll move on over to the next gauge, which is the altimeter. It's not the port rudder pedal, no. Pop-ups in a bit of the wrong location there. There we go, the altimeter. So the altimeter shows the current altitude above sea level. And there are 3 needles on this gauge. The longest needle is the 100-foot needle. The mid-length one is the 1,000-foot needle. And the shortest one is the 10,000-foot needle. But because of these 3 needles, this gauge is hardly easy to interpret in a stressful situation. And it's not surprising, I think, on later airplanes that they tended to do away with these 3 needle gauges. Now in this game, it is much easier to use the heads-up display, which is turned on and off by pressing the Control and H keys on your keyboard. I'll just turn it on right now, Control and H. Now this display also shows the time of day in the game, the current altitude, speed and heading. I just wish that it was user configurable, but unfortunately it isn't. Anyway, I'll just do Control H to turn that back off again. Now this game provides an altimeter adjustment knob that can be used by either left or right clicking on it, although there really is no need to do that in this game. But I'll just show you it anyway. So if I left click on it or right click on it, you can see it moves it clockwise and anti-clockwise. And I guess you could use that to correct for differences in sea level pressure, just to correct that altitude reading should you believe it to be incorrect. But in this game, it really, I don't think, takes those kind of nuances into account. I've never found any need to make adjustments to the altitude knobs in any of the aircraft modelled in this game. Okay, and next up we have a bank and turn indicator, and this is composed of a gyro type turn indicator, which is indicated by the white needle here, and a ball type bank indicator, and that's indicated by the ball down here and the yellow region at the bottom. Now the bank indicator at the bottom here is a liquid filled curved tube in which a free rolling inclinometer ball changes position according to the direction of the force of gravity and centrifugal force. Now the bank indicator is used to minimize side slip by the pilot, keeping the ball centered between a pair of parallel central reference lines while turning, although these reference lines are not shown in this game for the P-51. Now next up we have the climb or rate of climb indicator, and this shows the rate of ascent or descent of the aircraft. Now this is graduated from 0 to 6,000 feet per minute in both climbing and descending directions. And this indicator is primarily used to maintain a constant altitude when turning and to establish a definite rate of climb or descent when flying on instruments. Now moving further over, we have the landing gear and flaps indicator, and this normally provides a visual representation of the current position of the wheels and flaps. Unfortunately though, in this game, the P-51 landing gear and flaps indicator is broken and doesn't work. And this is really odd, seeing as this gauge does work for the other American fighters in this game, the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt, as well as the, well, certainly the 2 German fighters that I've also covered in this game so far as well, the Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. So it's rather odd that, for some reason, the poor P-51 never got the correct treatment. So there's a bug in the game, and this display is wrong and broken. We'll move on over now to the engine gauge, and that's this grouping of 3 instruments that we have here. Now we have the oil temperature gauge at the top, and this is in degrees centigrade. And below we have the oil and fuel pressure gauges in pounds per square inch. Now normal operating ranges are shown in green, while red lines indicate the permissible maximums and minimums as appropriate. Now when the engine is started, these gauges do move and they go into those green regions and they show fixed normal readings. Although again, these gauges can be safely ignored, seeing as engine management for the fighters in this game is not modelled. Now below the engine gauge we have the oxygen flow indicator and the oxygen pressure gauge. Again, we got those rudder pedals popping up there. So these gauges are used to verify that there's an adequate flow of oxygen being provided to the pilot. Now in this game I don't believe the oxygen system and damage to it is modelled, and I've never seen these gauges indicate anything other than normal indications. As such, I feel confident to say that again these both can be safely ignored. Okay, so next up we'll move on down here to the bottom left and we'll look at the engine control panel here. Now the engine control switch panel comprises the fuel booster pump switch, the oil dilution switch, the engine starter switch, and the primer switch. However, in this game only one switch is functional, and that is the starter switch. And again, it's the only one where the pop-up isn't enclosed in parentheses. And I'll show you use of this switch when I go through the engine startup procedure. Okay, so next up, we'll now move on down to the front switch panel. So it's the panel just at the bottom of the cockpit here. So I'm just going to use the hat switch on my joystick just to move the view down. And I'm actually just going to move my joystick over and hold it to get the control stick out of the way. So what do we have here? So first of all, we have the parking brake. So just above the panel is the parking brake handle, and this is toggled on and off by left clicking on it. So I can just left click on it there and that releases it, and the handle goes in, and when I left click on it again, that sets the parking brake and the handle is pulled out towards you. Now this can also be activated using the keyboard shortcuts of P to set the parking brake, and Shift P, I'll just do Shift P there to release the parking brake. So Shift P releases the parking brake, and I'll press P again to set the parking brake. Now below that we're going to go over through this panel now. So there's a lot of things on here, but many of them are actually non-functional. First of all, over at the top left we have the magneto switch. Now the magneto or ignition selector switch controls the magnetos used to supply power to the engine ignition system. And this has four possible positions. We have off, which is the position it's in at the moment. And the position is indicated by where this long arm is pointing to. So you can just make out off there. And if I think left click on this, it moves it round to the R or right position. And then if I left click on it once more, it then goes to the L or left position. And if I left click on it one more time, it moves over to the both position. And I can move this back by right clicking on it multiple times. Again, I will show use of this switch when I go through the engine startup procedure. Now to the right of the magneto we have the bomb and rocket switch. And again, as you'll see, this is enclosed in parentheses and it's therefore not functional in the game. You're not carrying any bombs or rockets as a P-51 escort fighter anyway. To the right of that we have the bomb arming switches. For some strange reason, they are not enclosed in parentheses and they do actually move, but they actually have absolutely no function in the game whatsoever, because you're not carrying any bombs and you're certainly not carrying any chemicals to be sprayed, and they have absolutely no purpose. So I really just don't know why you can click on these and make them move. Very strange. Okay, next up we have down here we have the guns and camera selector switch, and this would normally be used as a gun safety switch to arm or disarm the machine guns, as well as being able to turn on operation of the gun camera. Now, while this switch can be toggled again by left clicking on it, like the bomb arming switches, this actually does nothing in this game and doesn't even disarm and arm the machine guns. For instance, if I have it in the up position and I fire the machine guns, they fire. If I toggle that down, I can still fire the machine guns. So again, a completely useless switch, unfortunately. Then we move over here and we have the rocket release selector. And you can see that again, that's in parentheses, and therefore it's not functional in the game. You're not carrying rockets. Then we have the delay or / instant switch. And again, that's related, I believe, to the rockets. And again, it's enclosed in parentheses and it's not functional. And below that, we have a rocket number plate, which I think would indicate how many rockets you have left to be fired. For some reason, it shows 6, but we have 0 in reality. So kind of strange. But again, that's just a dummy number. It's not functional. And there's also a rocket selector knob. Again, this is not functional. So moving on further down now, we'll go down to the lower front switch panel. First of all, over here on the left, we have the fuel shutoff valve. And this controls the fuel flow from all tanks to the engine-driven fuel pump. Now to open this valve, it should be set to on, and you can do that by left-clicking on it. And to close this valve, it should be set to off by right-clicking on it. However, in fact, it's not necessary to ever use this valve in this game, as it is automatically opened and closed accordingly based on the position of the fuel mixture control handle or lever, which we'll come on to very shortly. Next up, we have the fuel tank selector valve, and this is used to select which fuel tank is feeding the engine. Now, only one fuel tank can be selected at a time, and as such, it was up to the pilot to balance fuel usage amongst the available tanks. Now the selector can be moved anti-clockwise by left-clicking on it, or clockwise by right-clicking on it. Now the tanks available are an 85-gallon fuselage tank, which is pointing to at the moment, a 92-gallon main tank located in the left wing, and that's activated by right-clicking, and that's that one there. Then we have, if I right-click again, we have a 75-gallon combat drop tank, and that's located under the right wing. Note that this label is on the left-hand side, but it actually relates to the right-hand drop tank. Next up, if I move this over to this one here, this is a 75-gallon combat drop tank, which is located under the left wing. And then if I right-click once more, we have a 92-gallon main tank located in the right wing. Now the fuel gauges for the two main tanks are located on the cockpit floor, as I'm showing here. So we've got the left wing tank fuel gauge here and the right wing tank fuel gauge here. Now the fuel gauge for the fuselage tank is located aft on the left hand side of the cockpit, and I'll just swing round to that right now. And so you can see the fuselage tank fuel gauge located there. Now the next thing just to mention here is that there are no fuel gauges for the drop tank, so that's an important thing to bear in mind, and that's the same as we saw on the P-47. Now next to the tank selector switch, we have the emergency hydraulic release handle. Now this is normally used in the event of failure of the hydraulic system, and it's used to lower the landing gear and is activated by left clicking on it. And in this game, this handle simply has the same effect as using the landing gear handle, which I'll cover in a moment, to lower the landing gear. Alternatively, you can simply use the keyboard shortcut of Shift and the up arrow. Now below the emergency hydraulic release handle, we have the hydraulic pressure gauge. Now the hydraulic pressure gauge obviously indicates the pressure in the hydraulic system, and this is measured in pounds per square inch. Now, as I say, in this game, I don't believe the hydraulic system is subject to damage when the engine is running, and I have never seen this gauge indicate anything other than a normal indication of around 1200 psi. And so I really do believe as such you can probably safely ignore that gauge. Okay, so I'm just going to let go of the control stick now, and we're just going to swing over and cover the left-hand side of the cockpit over here. So just get the view in a good place. There we go. So the first thing we'll look at is over on the far left. We'll have a look at the flap control lever. And this can be moved by either left or right clicking on it and dragging it up, the mouse I should say, up and down. So I'm left clicking on it there, keeping my mouse held down, and I'm just kind of moving my mouse up and down. Now this lever has 6 positions, which are fully retracted, which is when it's all the way down. You've got 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees, and 50 degrees, which is fully deployed. Now, using this lever is the only way to set intermediate flaps for the P-51 in the game. But alternatively, and far more practical, is to use the keyboard shortcuts of Shift and F to fully deploy your flaps. And obviously the handle hasn't moved because they're fully deployed anyway. And F to fully retract your flaps. You can see the handle now is moving down. And, note that normal takeoff is performed with the flaps fully retracted. And typically when you're landing this P-51 in the game, you'll fully extend the flaps. So there's generally not a need in the game to set intermediate flaps. You may want to set slightly intermediate flaps during combat. But again, that's entirely up to you to experiment with and see what you prefer. Next up, we have these two handles here, or these two levers. Both the carburetor cold and hot air control levers are enclosed in parentheses and are therefore not functional in the game. Next up, we have the coolant control switch, the oil control switch, and the landing light switch. All are enclosed in parentheses and therefore are not functional in this game. Then moving down, we have three knobs here. We've got the two knobs here on the top and a side knob here. And these are the rudder, aileron, and elevator trim tab controls. And they can all be adjusted by using the left and right mouse buttons to move them and adjust them. But unfortunately, as you have got no immediate visual indication of the effect of using these controls, because it's more or less impossible to actually have the view looking down at these controls and see outside the plane or the other instrumentation at the same time. I find them actually of little practical use in this game, using them within the cockpit here. Instead, what I do, and what I highly recommend, is that you use the Trim Tab keyboard shortcuts, details of which are provided on a reference card for the game. Now, you will certainly need to use the trim tabs, and so I cannot recommend enough that you learn those keyboard shortcuts. Next up, we have the landing gear handle. Now, the landing gear handle can be toggled between raising and lowering the landing gear by left clicking on it. And I'll just do that very quickly here. So left click and left click once more. When the handle is in its upper position, the landing gear is raised or raising. And in its lower position, the landing gear is lowering or lowered. However, it's much easier to use the keyboard shortcuts for this, and these can be achieved by pressing the up arrow to raise the landing gear and shift up arrow to lower the landing gear. Now we'll move on up to the throttle quadrant up here. So I'm just going to swing the view around a little bit. Just want to get it over to there. Okay. Now the throttle control handle, which is this one here. Now this is in effect used to set the desired manifold pressure and hence power from the engine to control airspeed. Now the throttle is fully animated all the way up to the full military power setting, which is 100%. And via the game's throttle controls or using the mouse here to move the handle. So I'm using the mouse there by left clicking on it and moving my mouse up and down. I can also use the throttle control on my joystick. I'll probably have to go into AI mode first and then come back out of AI mode. There we go. Now I'm using the throttle control on my joystick to do it. If you do find the throttle doesn't respond when you're using your external throttle control, it's very likely that you've been clicking on some of the other engine controls with your mouse, and oftentimes that will actually lock your throttle out of external control. And what you have to do is press M to go into AI mode and M again to go back into manual mode, and that will release the lock and allow you to use your external control again. Now when the engine is running and war emergency power is applied by pressing the K key on your keyboard, the throttle control handle actually moves further as it would have done in reality. So if this is up at 100% there, what actually happens is, and what they used to do is I have a safety wire here, what would happen is you would actually push the throttle further forward when you want more emergency power, and it would actually break the safety wire to, and it was really just a memoir to the pilot, to a resistance piece, just to remind him that if he wants to really push the engine, he's going to have to use some force first of all to break that wire, because wire emergency power, if it's left on for too long, can actually do significant damage to the engine, and the recommendation was no more than 5-minute bursts. So we'll just move the throttle back to 0 now. So next up we have the prop pitch handle, and this is used to set the propeller RPM, and you could monitor it via the RPM gauge over here. Now, high RPM settings are used when maximum performance is desired, such as for takeoff and combat, while lower settings are used for maximum fuel economy and reduced engine wear during less demanding stages of the flight. However, I'm certainly not convinced that fuel efficiency is modelled in this game, and I know for certain that engine wear isn't. As such, the need to adjust propeller pitch away from its default high setting, which is what it's in at the moment, I think is highly doubtful. That said, if you do wish to change propeller pitch, then simply left click on the handle and move your mouse up and down as necessary, while obviously monitoring the RPM gauge over here to achieve the desired RPM that you want to target. Now, the final piece on the throttle quadrant here is the mixture handle, or more appropriately, the mixture control lever, and this is used to set the fuel air mixture to the engine. Now, on earlier aircraft such as the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt, this lever had 4 possible positions, and these were idle cutoff, auto lean, auto rich, and full rich. However, on later aircraft such as the P-51 Thunderbolt, the auto lean and auto rich positions were replaced by a single run position, leaving 3 possible positions, that is idle cutoff, run, and full rich. Now, full rich was actually only used for emergencies in case of carburetor failure. However, in this game, this has been simplified further such that the lever only has 2 positions, and these aren't even correctly labelled. In the position it's in at the moment, this is idle cutoff, and if I left click on the mixture control handle, it's now in the run position. Now, idle cutoff is set when the lever is in the upper position, and it's moved there by right clicking on the handle when it's in the lower position here. So if I right click on it now, it moves it up. Now, this position is used after stopping the engine to ensure that no fuel is allowed to enter the carburetor while the engine is not running. Now, the run position is when the lever is in the lower position, and that's moved there by left clicking on the handle. Now, in this game, this also automatically moves the fuel shutoff valve here to the on position, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the run position is the standard operating setting for the engine, and in this game is used for starting the engine and whenever the engine is running. Now we'll move on over to the right. Here we have the left and right bomb salvo handles, and these are used to individually release the external fuel drop tanks. And this is achieved by left clicking on the appropriate handle. And I'll do one of them now and you'll hear a big explosion, so just bear with me. There you go, drop tank exploding underneath the P-51 here. I don't recommend you do that. Now, alternatively, and much easier, is to use the keyboard shortcut of Control and D, which drops both tanks simultaneously. And I'll actually do that when we are in flight after we've been through the startup, taxiing and taking off segments. Now, be aware that if your fuel selector valve is set to one of the drop tanks that is being jettisoned, as it is pointing to there, then the engine will stop due to fuel starvation. Now, the engine can be immediately restarted by either manually setting the fuel tank selector valve to one of the internal fuel tanks, which is any one of these 3 lower settings here, or by pressing M to switch to AI mode, in which case the AI will automatically reset the fuel selector valve for you. Now, remember to switch back to manual mode though if you do that after switching to AI mode, again simply by pressing the M key. However, note that when switching to AI mode, the AI may change the positions of your flaps and landing gear, so it's always best to double check those afterwards. Now, just a final few things here in the center of the cockpit. We have the left and right rudder pedals, or the port and starboard, probably is the more correct terms for them. Now these are not controlled from within the cockpit. You can't use your mouse on them, but they are animated here for your enjoyment. So if I do the rudder controls on my joystick, you can see the rudder pedals moving accordingly. And in the middle here we have the control stick. Again, this isn't controlled or controllable from within the cockpit, but it is by your joystick or by the keyboard controls, and it's nicely animated here. We also have at the top of the control stick, we have the machine gun firing button. Again, this isn't controlled from here, but again, if I use the fire button on my joystick, or you use the fire button on the keyboard, then that firing button is animated. Now remember that the P-51Ds in this game are equipped with 6 .5 caliber Browning machine guns. And like the P-47, the P-51 is not equipped with an indication of how much ammunition you have remaining. Now we'll move on over to the right hand side of the cockpit. Just do a rapid swing around there and come back a little bit. So first up over here we have the canopy release handle, and this is an emergency release, and this actually causes the pilot to bail out of the aircraft in the game. So to bail out the pilot using this handle, you would right click on it. Alternatively, you can use the keyboard shortcut of holding down Control and Shift together, and while they're held down, pressing the B key, B for bail. Next to that we have the canopy handle, which is a kind of crank handle to move the canopy backwards and forwards, but it's not functional in this game. Below that we have the electrical control panel. Now the upper bank of switches here includes a generator switch, a battery switch, the gun heater switch, the pitot heater switch, the wing position light switch, and the tail position light switch. And below those we have the recognition lights switches for the red light, the green light, and the amber light. Now the only switch that is active in this game on this panel is the battery switch, and that's the second one from the left on the top row. Now this is a toggle switch and is activated either on or off by just left clicking on it. In the up position it's in the off position, and when it's down it's in the on position. When set down to the on position, this actually is supplying battery power to the electrical system. Now this switch is used during the startup sequence, which I'll be going through very shortly. And this switch should remain on whenever the engine is running. If you were to turn it off, it would actually shut the engine down. Now there is also an ammeter on this panel, which is supposed to display the amount of current being supplied by the generator. However, in this game, this gauge simply moves again to a fixed normal indication reading. Now just to the right of the electrical control panel here, we have a couple of boxes over here. And these other boxes are simply graphical representations of various pieces of radio equipment, and they're not functional in this game. Well, that about concludes the cockpit tour. So now we'll move on to starting up the engine, taxiing, taking off, and landing. So at long last we are ready to start up the P-51D. Now the startup sequence is actually fairly short and simple, as it is for all of the fighters in this game. And there are two ways to initiate engine startup, the engine startup sequence I should say. And the first way is to have the AI run through the startup sequence automatically for you. And the second way is obviously to go through it manually. Now I'm going to show you the manual method, but before that I'm just going to describe how you get the AI to do it. Now in either case you have to be in manual mode to get the engine started. So we're going to press the M key first of all. Now if you want the AI to automatically go through the startup sequence, you just press the A key on your keyboard. Now you don't need to press any of the engine selection keys. The Q, W, E and R keys are only used to select engines when you are flying a multi-engine aircraft. So it's a nice simple engine start with the A key, and similarly if you want to have the AI go through the shutdown sequence, you would just press the S key. Now in terms of the manual startup sequence, again you have to be in manual mode as we are here, And I'm now just going to hold down Control and tap P so I can bring the screen down using the hat switch on my joystick. Now the first thing we need to do is to get electrical power to the systems, and we're going to do that by turning on the battery switch here. So it's the second switch from the left in this top row of switches here. So I'm just going to left click on that, and we can see a number of gauges automatically moving up into action there. So that gives us a good indication that the electrical power is onto the system. And just as an example of why these gauges for the engine are fairly redundant, as in things like the coolant temperature and the carburetor air temperature and the oil pressure and temperature, etc., is that you can see here, for instance, the coolant temperature has moved up to 100 degrees C. Now that would only normally be there after the engine has actually been running and has warmed up. So, you know, again, an indication that these are really just dummy gauges, despite the fact that it's nice to see them actually move on and off when the engine started or stopped. Well, I should say electrical power is applied and electrical power is cut off. Anyway, so battery switch to on is the first step. The next step is to set the magnetos to both. Now we do that by left clicking on the magneto switch 3 times, and I think you have to click towards the end of the switch piece here. So once, twice, and 3 times. So that's now set to both. Now the next setting to go through is to make sure that the throttle is set to 0. And I'm using my throttle controller on my joystick, and if you're using the keyboard, make sure that the throttle controller is set to 0, so it's all the way back as close to the pilot as possible. The next thing to do is to set the fuel mixture. Now the manual on page 119 of the English manual for the game, it says fuel mixture to full, and as I described in the prior section of this video, it's not actually full rich, because full rich really was an emergency setting. What we need to do is actually put it into the lower position, which in reality is the run position. So I'm just going to left click on that mixture handle to put it into the run position, and as we saw there, the fuel shutoff valve moved up to the on position. So that's opened fuel to the carburetor and the engine. And now the last piece is just to simply left click on the starter switch, which is the third from the left on this panel here. So we're just going to left click on that once. Now I've let go, and it just, if I get the screen in a good position, I'll Control P to get it centered. And we'll just wait for the engine to start. And there we go. That's the full startup sequence. So we'll now move on to taxiing, taking off, and landing. So we are almost ready to taxi and take off. So I just want to cover a few bits and pieces before we do, a few important items I just want to bring to your attention. The first thing is, if I just bring the screen down by tapping Control and P and using the hat switch on my joystick, just want to highlight this label on the instrument dash here. And it says here, move stick forward to unlock the tail wheel. Now, the P-51 actually had a fairly unique feature in it, in that to unlock the tail wheel, you would actually push the control stick forward and hold it there, and that would unlock the tail wheel. There was no separate tail lock lever in the cockpit, as you will have seen on the other fighter school videos for the other fighters in the game. And as soon as you release the control stick, and it's in any other position apart from forward, the tail wheel is automatically locked. Now that's an interesting feature, and one of the reasons for that was because the P-51 in reality had what they called a steerable tail wheel feature. And the tail wheel in its locked position was such that it could actually turn up to 6 degrees in either direction. And that allowed you to actually do some kind of smooth and gentle turns with the tail wheel locked. And that was actually important in that the P-51, like many of the other fighters in the game, was actually a blind aircraft. When you are looking out of the cockpit, you can't actually see the taxiway ahead of you. And as I've mentioned in prior videos, fighter school videos that is, the recommendations tended to be that the pilots would have to go down the taxiway in a lazy S fashion, and that allowed the pilots to put the plane into an angled position down the taxiway, and therefore they could look out the kind of forward side of their cockpits, and they would often taxi with their canopies back so they could stick their heads out. And that would allow them to see where they were going. And so this 6-degree movement on the steerable tail wheel allowed them to do that without unlocking their tail wheel. Now, an interesting thing that I've actually seen watching some of the wartime videos of P-51s taxiing was that in virtually all of the ones I've seen, they actually had ground personnel either lying or sitting on one of the wings, about halfway along the wing. And the ground personnel sitting or lying there would be the eyes for the pilot while taxiing. And what this allowed them to do was to taxi without going through this S-ing maneuver. And so the ground personnel acted as the eyes for the pilot, and they would use hand signals or verbal commands to the pilots, who would have their canopies back, as I say, and so they could communicate with the ground personnel on the wing. And so I think that allowed them to taxi probably far more quickly than they would have done otherwise, and it was far easier for the pilots to do that. So that was something I found as a bit of a revelation watching those wartime videos. Now, for sharp turns, though, the 6-degree movement of the steerable tail wheel was inadequate, and they would actually have to push the stick forward to unlock the tail wheel to allow them to do those sharp turns. Now, unfortunately in this game, the steerable tail wheel feature hasn't been implemented. And when the tail wheel is locked, you cannot turn the P-51 at all. So you have to unlock the tail wheel for any turn, no matter how significant or insignificant that turn may be. Now, another important consideration for locking and unlocking of the tail wheel is that the keyboard shortcuts for that do not work in this game for the P-51. Because of the unique unlocking and locking feature using the control stick, the keyboard commands do not work. So if I were to use Shift and T to unlock the tail wheel, it doesn't actually unlock the tail wheel. The only way to unlock the tail wheel is to push the control stick forward or use the keyboard command that effectively pushes that control stick forward. If the control stick is in any other position, that is the only way to lock the tail wheel. Pressing T on the keyboard doesn't do it, despite the fact that the message comes up at the bottom of the screen. So just bear that in mind. Now, the other thing I just want to raise before we go through the taxiing and taking off is that the flaps are not needed in this game for takeoff. Now, in practice, with the weight of the external drop tanks, the pilots of P-51s may have set partial flaps due to the extra weight of those tanks, but in this game you don't need to do that. You take off very, very easily with the flaps fully retracted. And the only other thing I just want to mention, which we'll do at the end of the runway, is we will set a bit of trim before we actually start to accelerate down the runway to take off. Now, in reality, this actually occurred as well. The pilots were recommended to set a rudder trim of 7 degrees right rudder, and that was to counteract the torque effects of the engine. They were also recommended to set the tail to a heavy elevator trim setting of 6 degrees, and that was to keep the tail down for as long as possible during the acceleration down the runway. And again, that was to try and allow the aircraft to stay straight down the runway for as long as possible. So I think that's about it. I think we will now go to the exterior view, because that is the most advantageous view for taxiing in this game. And we'll start to taxi and take off. So I'm going to press the F2 key to go to the exterior view. And as per usual, even with the parking brake applied and the throttle at 0, the P-51 here has crept forward, and this seems to be a little bit of a bug in this game. In any case, so I'm now going to release the parking brake by holding down Shift and tapping P. And I'm just going to bring the throttle up very slightly. And because we're going off of the taxiway, I'm going to unlock the tail wheel by pushing the control stick forward, and I'm going to apply a little bit of left rudder just to bring us back onto the taxiway. I'm actually just going to right click and move the mouse forward just to zoom into the P-51 here a bit more. So control stick forward, a little bit of right rudder. We're going a little bit fast, so I'm just going to throttle back a bit, keeping the control stick forward to keep the tail wheel unlocked, and I'm using the hat switch on my joystick to turn. Didn't do that very well. We've come away from the taxiway a bit too much there. Actually should have had the heads up display on, so I'm going to hold down control and tap H for that, because I really should have been monitoring my speed during taxiing. And you want to keep the speed somewhere between about 5 and 10 miles an hour so that you have good controllability. If you go any faster, you do tend to spin a little bit out of control when you try and turn. So again, I've got my control stick forward so the tail wheel is unlocked, and I'm doing very gentle movements with the rudder just to turn. Just going to keep going a little bit more. So I want to make sure I get to around the center of the runway here. There we go, it's probably enough, so I'm just going to straighten up now. Oops. There we go. Right, throttle back. I'm letting go of the control stick to lock the tail wheel, and I'm going to press P on the keyboard to set the parking brake. Now, as I said before, to counteract the torque effects of the P-51, I'm actually going to apply a little bit of rudder trim, and to keep the tail down, I'm going to apply a bit of elevator trim. Now, what I found is in this game, although the torque effects would normally have caused the P-51 to actually kind of peel off to the left a bit down the runway, I've actually found it's a little bit odd. Sometimes I found the P-51 will veer off to the left a bit, other times I found it will veer off to the right. Now, I don't understand why that happens in this game. The torque effect of the engine is not clearly modeled very accurately. But what I found is that applying a little bit of rudder trim by holding down control and tapping insert 4 times tends to counteract most of those effects. But what you'll find is that the fighter will probably still tend to move left or right a bit as you're trundling down the runway, and you just have to counteract that with a little bit of rudder movement as you go. So I'm going to apply that rudder trim right now. I'm going to hold down control and tap insert 4 times. So once, twice, 3 times and 4 times. And you won't really see any visible indication of that, because holding down control means that that was a little bit of fine trim adjustment, and you generally don't see those fine movements replicated on the exterior view here. I'm now going to apply a bit of elevator trim, and to do that I'm going to hold down shift and tap home 3 times, because that's about what I found works quite well. So shift and home 3 times. Once, twice, 3 times. And you may have seen a little bit of movement in the elevators there accordingly. So that's about it. So I'm going to gently bring up the throttle. You do not want to raise it up really quickly. Well, I'm going to release the parking brakes first by holding down shift and tapping P. Bring the throttle up. Apply a little bit of rudder as necessary to keep us straight down the runway. And I'm also going to gently pull back on the stick to keep the tail down. And you just need to do that very, very gently. Otherwise you will go into a very steep climb. I've also found that the P-51 in this game tends to peel off to the left once you've taken off. And once we've taken off, I will apply a bit of trim to counteract that. So as soon as you start to leave the ground, you want to move your control stick to the right to counter that a bit. So without further ado, let's get going. So I'm going to hold down shift and tap P to release the parking brake. I'm going to bring the throttle up very slowly. We're moving off to the right a bit, so I'm applying a little bit of left rudder, and I'm pulling back on the control stick at the same time. That's it, we're peeling off to the right, so I want to counter that with a bit of right hand movement on the control stick, and I'm going to raise the landing gear, which you can do by either pressing the button you've assigned to that or pressing the up key on the keyboard. So now I'm going to apply a little bit of aileron trim, because we keep having a tendency to peel off to the left. I'm going to do that by holding down control and tapping delete 6 times. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that should counter most of that. We've gone into a bit of a steep climb, so I'm going to reduce the elevator trim that we had before by holding down shift and tapping end twice. And that's about it. It's not a very elegant takeoff. I'm still learning myself, so I watch some of the guys who play IL2 and DCS and the other, far more advanced flight sims, and I always am in kind of awe at how beautifully they take off and land. But yeah, I'm still learning. I'm not really a dedicated flight sim guy quite yet, but I'm certainly getting there. The enjoyment I've been having with this game it's certainly given me a taste for trying some of the more advanced flight sims and flying the fighters in those games. So anyway, we'll get there. So we are in a fairly steep climb here. That's not looking too bad. The alternative is, instead of kind of trying to just reverse those trim settings manually, you can always just set them all to neutral in one quick go by holding down control and tapping backspace. I found a little bug in the game that sometimes when I do that, it sometimes throws you back into AI control, and I don't know why that happens. But if it does, then you'll need to go back into manual control and press control and backspace again. The disadvantage of doing that is that all of the trim settings go to neutral, and you would maybe need to apply some more trim elsewhere that you wouldn't necessarily need to do otherwise. But I am actually going to do that now, because you don't need the rudder trim really after you've taken off. That 7 degrees of rudder, or the control and insert 4 times that I did, you don't need that applied after you've taken off. So I'm going to do control and backspace, and you can see the plane jerked a bit there, and we're now heavily banking off to the left because I've now lost the aileron trim I had set. So I'm now going to redo the aileron trim there. So control and delete 6 times. So I've applied that, and now I'm just going to do shift and home, which sometimes does the speeding up. It doesn't seem to acknowledge that shift is held down. So I'm going to hold down shift and try that again, and it's taken this time. So 1 home, press there, shift and home, and that will keep us in a gentle climb. So I'm actually just going to trim the plane out here, get us into a level flight, and I will skip the video, and I'll be back with you in a moment once I'm in level flight. Okay, so that actually didn't take too long. We're in a nice level stable flight now, and so what I just want to demonstrate is, first of all, ejecting the drop tanks from underneath here, and I just want to demonstrate the loss of engine power if you have the tank setting set to the external drop tank. So we're going to head inside by pressing F1. And I'm going to do Control P, and I'm going to use the hat switch on my joystick to move the view down. And I'm going to just, unfortunately, you can't actually clearly see the fuel tank selector valve unless I were to move the control stick out of the way, which is kind of awkward, isn't it? So, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to right click on the fuel tank selector valve so that it's on one of the drop tanks. Okay. So we're going to go to the exterior view by pressing F2. Get ourselves straightened up a bit. See, the trim's not perfect. And I'm actually just going to do the keyboard shortcuts to do the release both drop tanks here. So I'm going to hold down Control and tap D. And there we go. The engine has now stopped. So I can either press M and M, so we quickly go into AI mode. And the AI will switch the fuel tank selector valve to an internal fuel tank, I should say. So I'm going to do that manually. So we're back on the inside. Now the interesting thing is you can see that the tank selector valve has moved to one of the interior tanks, but for some reason it hasn't actually taken. The engine has not restarted. So I'm actually going to have to click on that once. There you go. And that switched it to the wing, the left-hand wing main tank. I'm actually going to left click on that to take it down to the fuselage tank. But that's a bit odd, isn't it? That it had moved that switch round automatically to one of those interior tanks, but the engine hadn't restarted. And I've seen that in some of the other fighters as well. So that's just something to bear in mind. Obviously, the easiest thing to do is just to press M, go into AI mode, and M again. But the annoying thing about that is sometimes the AI will drop the landing gear, it will adjust your flaps, it may mess with your trim settings. So you may have to reset those again after coming back out of AI mode. Anyway, we're going into some crazy attitude here, so I'm going to go to the exterior view. and see what's going on. Now, obviously, once you drop the drop tanks, the aerodynamics of your plane change dramatically. And so you do need to reset your trim after you've dropped those drop tanks. Now, why do you drop those drop tanks? You would always drop those drop tanks when you are going to go into combat, because the P-51 and any other fighter with external drop tanks will be far less maneuverable with the drop tanks still attached. So the recommendation and the practice always was that once you're about to go into combat, get rid of your drop tanks at that time. That's the moment that you would release them. So I'm just going to retrim the P-51 here. I'm then going to demonstrate war emergency power, and then we're going to head back to base and go through our landing. Okay, I think that's stable enough flight for us to now apply some war emergency power. And so you apply war emergency power by just simply pressing the K key on the keyboard. And we're going to do this from inside the P-51 just so you can see the instruments and the effects of war emergency power on the engine, etc. Now, as I say, in this game, engine management is not modeled for the fighter, so it doesn't matter how long you leave war emergency power on for in this game. In reality, you weren't supposed to leave it on for more than 5 minutes, and generally no more than 15 minutes for any single mission. There was a significant danger of damage to the engine if you left it on for too long. But as I say, in this game it really doesn't matter. So we'll press F1 now to go inside. I'm just going to hold down Control and tap P, and then use the hat switch on the keyboard just to move the view down so we can see the instrument panel. Now, the key things to watch are the manifold pressure, which is the moniker for power output from the engine, the throttle position here, because what you'll notice is when I put war emergency power on, this throttle will actually move forward, as I discussed in an earlier section of this video, and also note the engine RPM. Now, as you noticed, we are at 100% throttle here. The manifold pressure is around its maximum military power setting of around 61 PSI. Was it PSI? I can't remember what the units are. Sorry, folks. Anyway, I'm just going to press K now on the keyboard to apply war emergency power. We get a label at the bottom that flags up, and war emergency power should have moved forward to about 67 there, and it has done, which is fantastic. And what we'll see is now our speed is increasing accordingly. So I'm now going to turn off war emergency power, and we should see the manifold pressure drop back down to 61, and we should see our throttle change position again. And if you noticed, the RPM didn't change at all during that procedure. That is really controlled using the propeller pitch, which we're not going to play around with in this video. Because as I said before, you really don't need to adjust propeller pitch in this game, because over revving the engine doesn't matter. With engine management not modelled and engine damage not modelled from over revving the engine, it really is irrelevant. So I'm just going to press K to turn war emergency power off. Our throttle lever there moved up a bit. Our manifold pressure is dropping back down to 61. And as we can see here, our speed is now gradually dropping off. If we weren't going into a dive, it would drop off a little bit more dramatically than that. So that's it, folks. So that's really war emergency power. And you use really war emergency power in primarily, I guess, in a combat situation where you really need a burst of power to either accelerate to chase an enemy, or I guess to get out of a very sticky situation. So I'm just going to do Control P twice now to get us back to our normal locked upper cockpit view. And so now to head back to the airbase, we need to figure out, well, what's the heading back to our airbase. And the game provides a very neat shortcut for doing this, and it padlocks the camera view in the direction of the nearest airbase. And to do that, I'm going to hold down Shift and tap Y, and that padlocks the nearest airfield. So now what we can do is we can use the control stick to bank left, and I'm going to pull back on the joystick now to start turning. And I'm just making this turn to be a fairly slow and gentle affair until we start to get the cockpit, or the camera I should say, pointing through the front of the cockpit. Clearly overshot a bit there, so I'm having to come back. So generally you can say that the airfield is now located right in the center of the screen, right in the center of the camera's view. So that's where we want to get the, I guess, the gun sight pointing towards. And that's it, folks. That's us now heading back towards our airfield. So I'll just skip the video forward here, and I'll see you on our final approach. So folks, we are flying over the airfield now, so I'm going to do a couple of 90-degree bends and all the time kind of bring our speed down. And once we get onto our final approach, I'll lower the landing gear and deploy the flaps. Now in reality, lowering the landing gear and deploying the flaps really shouldn't be done above about 165, 170 miles an hour. Otherwise they would suffer mechanical damage, and if you were going markedly faster than that, they would actually be ripped off. And that's certainly modeled in some of the flight sims. It's not modeled in this game though. If you did deploy the landing gear at excessive speed, then it's deployed. It doesn't get ripped off, which is kind of unfortunate because it's kind of cool to see. Certainly not fun for the pilot, that is, anyway. So the airfield's just over there. I'm bringing our speed down a bit more. I'll try and get lined up on this runway. This is one of my greatest failings in this game. I'm going to lower the landing gear. I'm really not very good at landing. So shift and up arrow to deploy the landing gear, and then shift and F once you're almost lined up with the runway to deploy the flaps. It's still coming in a bit too fast, so I want to throttle back there a bit more. Yeah, we should have landed a bit sooner. You want to land at about the first third of the runway rather than what I've done here. There you go, not too bad, a bit bumpy. So anyway, it's an example of a landing. It's not an example of a good landing. Okay, really you want to try, as I say, land in about the first third of the runway. So we'll start to taxi back to our stand, and we'll end the session there. Going way too fast off the end of the runway. I really should pay attention more. As I said in prior videos, I'm actually not very good at actually talking on a video and doing it at the same time. Anyway, we'll retract our flaps by pressing the F key. We don't need those anymore. We should be taxiing at a far slower speed, and I've gone way past where I should be. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, we'll just trundle across the grass to get to our stand. Okay, folks, I do apologise. I really should pay attention to what I'm doing more. I find it really hard to get the throttle speed right in this, or to get the power output from the engine right with this, because even though I've now got joystick curves set up to dramatically reduce the sensitivity of my joystick and throttle, I still find that even with small movements of both, it overshoots dramatically on what I want it to do in this game. I'm still struggling with this T-Flight HOTAS X. I don't know if that's the issue. I don't know if it's just user error on my part, or whether I'd be far better off with another joystick setup, which I suspect I will, and I will upgrade one day, because I really do think that will be leaps and bounds better than the T-Flight HOTAS X. But the T-Flight HOTAS X is a great starter kit, and it certainly served me perfectly fine for getting to where I am today. And we'll, once I maybe graduate onto more detailed flight sims, then I will probably upgrade to a better joystick or HOTAS setup at that time. Anyway, I'm rambling now. I'm just going to zoom in to the aircraft here, and what we'll just do is we will now just shut down the engine to complete this fighter score. So I'm going to do that manually. I'm going to press F1 to head inside. I'm going to do Shift U to unlock the padlocked camera view, and then Control P, and I'm going to use the hat switch to move down. so we can shut down the engine. So we'll shut down the engine by putting the fuel mixture handle into the idle cutoff position. And we'll do that by right-clicking on it, and that also automatically shuts fuel off to the engine. We will then right-click on the magneto switch multiple times to turn the magnetos off, and then finally we will left-click on the battery switch to isolate electrical power to the system. And that's it, folks. I'll do Control P just to lock us back up there, and a nice view of the sun filtering through the clouds. That ends this fighter school. I hope this has been useful for you. If you like this video, please click on the thumbs up below. If you've got any comments, suggestions, if you just want to be really angry and shout at me, just let it out in the comment section below. Thank you very much, folks. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.